Billionaire paid $3,000 for poor virgin Maid to be his family dinner date. That night, this happened. The first mistake Crowe made was assuming desperation always looks desperate. For $3,000, he hired a woman he believed would disappear quietly at his family's table. Smile. Sit still. Say nothing. But that night, inside one of New York's most powerful old money families, a maid would be mistaken for weak, a secret would be uncovered, and a single moment would decide who truly belonged at the table. Because before dawn, one heart would stop and another would be revealed. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Who was Elowen Hale, and why did nothing about her look like desperation? Why did the Crowe sisters panic when they couldn't find her past? And what happened that night that made a billionaire realize the poorest person at his table was never her? Stay with this story because the truth doesn't arrive loudly. It arrives quietly and changes everything. Elowen Hale had learned early that grief rarely announces itself. It simply empties rooms. Her father died first, a stroke that arrived without warning and stole the voice that guided their home. Her mother followed months later, not from sorrow alone, but from illness postponed too long because survival came first. At 20, Elowen buried both parents and inherited two smaller lives that still needed breakfast, school shoes, and hope. So she cleaned houses she once would have visited as a guest. Not because she was uneducated, but because dignity does not pay rent. She worked. She prayed quietly. And she learned something most people never do. Kindness without discernment is just surrender. Elowen's father had been a professor of urban planning at City College, a man whose integrity was legendary among his students. Her mother taught elementary school in Brooklyn, spending her evenings grading papers at their kitchen table while humming hymns from her childhood church. Their home in Crown Heights was modest but filled with books, laughter, and a faith that didn't need to prove itself. Sunday mornings meant early service at Greater Faith Baptist, where Elowen sang in the youth choir and her father served as a deacon. When her father collapsed during a faculty meeting, the doctors said his heart simply gave out. Too much stress. Too many years carrying other people's burdens. Elowen remembers the hospital chaplain asking if they wanted to pray, and her mother saying yes, always yes, even when the monitors had already gone silent. 3 months later, her mother's diagnosis came. Stage 4. The kind of cancer that doesn't negotiate. She had known but said nothing because there were tuition payments to make and her husband's medical bills to settle. Elowen held her mother's hand as she transitioned from this world to the next. Her last words were not about regret or fear. She whispered, "Take care of them, baby. And remember, God doesn't measure us by what we lose. He measures us by what we do with what remains." Then she closed her eyes and let go. What remained were Marcus and Amara, Elowen's younger siblings. Marcus was 14, brilliant with computers, struggling with anger he couldn't name. Amara was 11, still young enough to believe their parents were just away for a while. Elowen became mother, father, provider, and protector overnight. She dropped out of Columbia University where she'd been studying social policy on a full scholarship. She moved them into a smaller apartment in East New York. She took every cleaning job she could find. The houses she cleaned belonged to people who had never considered what it meant to lose everything. They left cash on counters like it was decoration. They complained about vacations while she calculated whether she could afford both electricity and groceries that month. But Elowen never stole. Never cut corners. Never allowed bitterness to remake her into something her parents wouldn't recognize. She scrubbed toilets in penthouses and prayed over her siblings' homework at night. She sang the same hymns her mother had sung. And she trusted that somehow, somewhere, faithfulness still mattered. Her supervisor at the cleaning agency, Ms. Lorraine, was the one who mentioned the unusual request. A private client needed someone for a dinner. Just one evening. Professional appearance required. Compensation was $3,000. Good. Lorraine looked at Elowen carefully when she explained it. They want someone who can blend in at a high society event. Someone refined. Someone who won't embarrass them. She paused. Someone who knows how to be invisible when necessary. Elowen understood immediately what wasn't being said. They wanted someone presentable enough to sit at their table but forgettable enough to dismiss afterward. Someone they could pay to perform normalcy for an evening and then erase. The money would cover 2 months of rent. It would buy Marcus the laptop he needed for school. It would let Amara join the dance program she'd been asking about. $3,000 for one night of pretending she belonged somewhere she didn't. She took the job. Not because she was desperate, but because sometimes faith requires you to walk through doors you don't fully understand. Her mother used to say that God often sends provision in packages we wouldn't choose for ourselves. Eloan chose to believe that this strange, uncomfortable offer might be one of those packages. She had no idea that by saying yes, she was stepping into a story that would expose everyone at that table, including herself. The Crowe estate did not welcome outsiders. It evaluated them. The mansion sat in the oldest section of Bedford, New York, surrounded by stone walls that had witnessed 2 centuries of American wealth. Inside, everything gleamed with the kind of perfection that required invisible labor. Maribel Crowe, Alastair's older sister, smiled with surgical precision as she greeted guests in the foyer. Rowena, the younger sister, watched without blinking from her position near the grand staircase. And Alastair, cold, polished, exhausted by women who wanted his name more than his soul, introduced Elowen as if she were temporary furniture. "This is Elowen. She'll be joining us this evening." No explanation. No context. Just enough information to create questions he clearly had no intention of answering. The other guests, mostly business associates and distant family members, nodded politely and returned to their conversations about markets and mergers. But Elowen did not perform poverty. She had been raised in rooms where education mattered more than money, where respect was earned through character, not inherited through blood. She knew which fork to use because her mother had taught her. She understood art history because her father had taken her to museums every Saturday. She could discuss literature, politics, and philosophy because learning had always been valued in her home, even when wealth was not. So when Maribel asked a pointed question about the opera season, Elowen answered with genuine insight about a recent production of Porgy and Bess at the Met. When a guest mentioned affordable housing crises in New York, Elowen suggested community land trusts as a sustainable model, explaining the framework with the same clarity her father had used in his lectures. When the conversation turned to recent fiction, she referenced a novel she'd been reading with her old book club from church, one that explored generational trauma and redemption. And people listened. Not because she commanded attention but because authenticity has a frequency that cuts through performance. The staff members who refilled water glasses and cleared plates noticed too. Elowen thanked them by name after Alastair made introductions, asked about their shifts, remembered details they mentioned. She treated them like human beings, not scenery. Cordelia Crowe, 70 years old and sharp as winter air, noticed everything. She sat at the head of the table in a wheelchair, her body weakened by age but her mind still ruthlessly perceptive. She had built half the Crowe fortune herself through strategic investments when women weren't supposed to understand finance. She had survived a husband who drank himself to death and children who fought over his money before his body was cold. She did not tolerate pretense. Halfway through dinner, Cordelia asked Elowen to sit beside her. The request was not negotiable. Elowen moved gracefully, aware that every eye in the room was tracking her movement. Cordelia took her hand and held it, studying Elowen's face with an intensity that felt like being read. "You're not what he said you were," Cordelia said quietly. It wasn't a question. Elowen met her gaze and replied simply, "No, ma'am. I'm not." And the room shifted. Because hierarchy only works when everyone agrees to pretend. The moment Cordelia claimed Elowen as worthy of genuine attention, the carefully constructed narrative began to crack. Maribel's smile tightened. Rowena's watching became surveillance. Alastair felt something he hadn't anticipated: exposure. He had hired Elowen to be a shield, a buffer against his family's judgment about his lack of a serious relationship. Instead, she was becoming a mirror, reflecting everything hollow about the evening. By dessert, Cordelia was asking Elowen about her family, her faith, her life. Elowen answered honestly. She didn't hide her parents' deaths or her siblings' existence. She didn't pretend to be anything other than a woman doing her best with what remained. She spoke about her church, about the community that had helped her survive the worst year of her life, about the small mercies that kept her believing in something larger than circumstance. Cordelia listened with an expression Elowen couldn't quite read. Then the older woman said something that would later prove prophetic. "Real wealth is knowing who you are when everything else is taken away. Most people at this table have never been tested like that. You have. That makes you richer than all of us." The comment landed like a stone in still water. Ripples of discomfort spread across the dining room. Maribel excused herself abruptly. Rowena's jaw tightened visibly. Alastair stared at his grandmother with something between frustration and fear. Because Cordelia Crowe had just elevated a paid guest above her own bloodline, and everyone knew it. What Alastair didn't know yet was that his sisters had already started digging. Before the first course was served, Rowena had texted a private investigator she kept on retainer. By the time dessert arrived, Maribel had 3 different background check services searching for anything they could find on Elowen Hale. They needed leverage. They needed proof that this woman was exactly what they suspected. An opportunist, a fraud, someone dangerous to their family's legacy. But what they found instead would become a weapon of a different kind. Public records showed 2 deceased parents. An eviction notice from 18 months ago. Employment records from a cleaning service. And a detail that Maribel seized on with vindictive precision. Eloan's current employer. She wasn't just a woman down on her luck. She was a maid. Hired help. Someone who cleaned toilets for people like them. Maribel's smile returned, sharp and certain. She had found her ammunition. And she was already planning how to use it. If this story has your heart racing, comment, "I'm still watching." Let's see who's truly here till the end. Rowena searched harder after dinner ended. While guests moved to the parlor for drinks, she sat in Alistair's study with her laptop, cross-referencing every piece of information she could extract about Elowen Hale. Investigators sent reports. Whispers from old family friends confirmed suspicions. And then Maribel entered with the word meant to stain everything. Maid. "She cleans houses, Alistair," Maribel said, her voice low and venomous. "She scrubs our friends' toilets for minimum wage. And you brought her here. To grandmother's table. You introduced her like she was someone respectable." The disgust in her tone was not about the work itself but about the proximity. The contamination of their space by someone they considered beneath them. Alistair felt exposed in a way money had always protected him from. Humiliation crept up his spine. His sisters stood in judgment, their eyes full of accusations he couldn't deny. He had paid Eloan to solve a problem. His grandmother's increasing pressure for him to settle down, to bring someone appropriate to family events. He had chosen Eloan because she seemed safe, educated enough to blend in, desperate enough to accept his terms, quiet enough to disappear afterward. But she hadn't disappeared. She had become visible in ways that threatened the entire performance. And now his sisters knew. Soon everyone would know. The humiliation wouldn't just be private. It would be social. Professional. The kind of embarrassment that follows you through boardrooms and country clubs. He found Elowen in the garden, standing near a fountain under the cold November sky. She wasn't hiding. She was simply breathing, taking a moment away from the performance they were all trapped in. Alistair approached with anger he tried to disguise as disappointment. "You didn't tell me the truth about who you were," he said, his voice tight with accusation. Elowen turned slowly, her expression calm. "You didn't ask who I was. You asked if I could play a role. I can. I did." There was no apology in her voice. No shame. Just a statement of fact that somehow made everything worse. "My sisters found out you're a maid," Alistair continued, the word tasting bitter in his mouth. "They're going to destroy you for this. For making me look foolish." He said it like a warning, but it sounded more like a threat. Elowen studied him with the same clarity she'd shown Cordelia. Then she spoke, and her words cut deeper than any anger could have. "I didn't make you look foolish, Alistair. You made yourself look foolish by assuming poverty and worth were the same thing. I agreed to dinner. Not judgment. Not humiliation. Not whatever game your family plays to feel superior." She paused, letting the silence build. "My father was a professor. My mother was a teacher. They raised me to value people, not positions. When they died, I didn't stop being their daughter. I didn't stop being educated or dignified or faithful. I just stopped having money. If that makes me unworthy of sitting at your table, then your table was never worth sitting at." The truth of it stung worse than any insult. Alistair had spent his entire life surrounded by people who wanted access to his wealth, his name, his influence. He had become expert at detecting ulterior motives. But Elowen had none. She didn't want anything from him except the payment they'd agreed upon. She didn't need him. And that terrified him more than his sister's anger ever could. Because for the first time, Alistair realized something fundamental about his own life. He had spent years collecting people who reinforced his importance. Friends who laughed at his jokes because of his bank account. Women who loved his last name more than his first. Business partners who needed his capital. Even his family measured their affection in inheritance projections. But Elowen measured him by his character. And he was coming up short. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice stripped of its earlier authority. It was the question of a man suddenly unsure of his own value. Elowen's answer was simple. "Nothing. I want nothing from you, Alistair. I came here for money to take care of my family. I did what you asked. Now I'd like to leave with my dignity intact." She started to walk past him, back toward the house where she'd left her coat. But Alistair caught her arm, not roughly but desperately. "Stay. Please. Just through the night. I'll double the payment. 5,000. 6. Whatever you need." The offer came out like a confession. He wasn't asking her to keep playing a role. He was asking her not to abandon him to face his family's judgment alone. Elowen looked at his hand on her arm, then at his face. She saw something there that surprised her. Not arrogance. Fear. The kind of fear that lives in people who've built their entire identity on foundations they didn't choose and can't control. She had seen that fear before in families at her church who'd lost jobs or homes, who suddenly had to confront who they were when everything external was stripped away. "I'll stay," she said quietly. "Not for more money. But because running away from hard truths never made anyone free." It was something her mother used to say. A belief rooted in a faith that demanded honesty even when honesty hurt. They returned to the house together, and the night continued. But something had shifted. Alistair stopped performing wealth and started observing. He watched how Elowen engaged with staff, how she listened to Cordelia's stories about the depression, how she deflected Maribel's pointed questions without losing her composure. He saw what his grandmother had seen, a person who knew herself completely regardless of circumstance. Meanwhile, Maribel and Rowena plotted. They decided to expose Elowen publicly, to humiliate her in front of the remaining guests. They would frame it as protecting their brother from a con artist. They would make her an example of why boundaries mattered, why people needed to stay in their proper places. They rehearsed their lines, sharpened their cruelty, and waited for the perfect moment. That moment would come. But not in the way they expected. Because sometimes the tables we set for judgment become the stages for our own exposure. The rain started just before midnight, a cold November storm that rattled the mansion's historic windows. Most of the dinner guests had left, but a few lingered in the parlor, nursing expensive whiskey and discussing business deals. Cordelia sat near the fireplace, wrapped in a cashmere blanket, watching the flames with an expression of deep contemplation. Elowen sat nearby, having been summoned again by the older woman's quiet insistence. They were discussing faith of all things. Cordelia had asked Elowen about her church, about what kept her believing when life had taken so much. Elowen spoke carefully, aware that genuine faith often made wealthy people uncomfortable. But Cordelia pressed further, asking questions that revealed her own spiritual wrestling. "I've spent 70 years accumulating things," Cordelia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Money, property, influence. I told myself it was for security, for family. But tonight, looking at you, I realize I've been hoarding because I was afraid of being helpless. Of needing someone and having nothing to offer in return." Elowen listened, recognizing the confession for what it was. A woman at the end of her life, finally confronting what mattered. "My mother told me that God doesn't need our wealth," Elowen said gently. "He wants our trust. And trust is hardest when we have the most to lose." Cordelia reached for Elowen's hand, gripping it with surprising strength. "Your mother was wise. I wish I'd known her." There was regret in her voice, the kind that comes from recognizing missed opportunities too late. That's when it happened. Cordelia's face changed. Color drained from her cheeks. Her breathing became shallow, rapid. Her grip on Elowen's hand tightened painfully. "I can't," she gasped. "I can't breathe." Panic exploded through the parlor. Maribel screamed for someone to call an ambulance. Rowena froze, her phone slipping from her hand. Alistair rushed forward but stopped, paralyzed by the sight of his grandmother collapsing. Guests backed away, unsure how to help, afraid of making things worse. But Elowen moved. She remembered the signs. The waiting. The regret. She had watched her mother's heart fail in a hospital room while doctors worked frantically around them. She had learned what to do and what not to do in those terrible moments. She guided Cordelia gently to the floor, supporting her head, keeping her airway clear. She spoke calmly, firmly, issuing instructions to the panicked family members around her. "Call 911 now. Tell them possible heart attack, 70-year-old female, conscious but struggling to breathe. Alistair, get me a blanket to keep her warm. Maribel, I need you to unlock the front gate so the ambulance can get through. Move." Her voice carried authority born from necessity, not status. People obeyed without thinking because certainty is magnetic in crisis. Elowen loosened Cordelia's clothing, monitored her pulse, kept her talking to prevent panic from making everything worse. "Stay with me, Mrs. Crowe," Elowen said, her voice steady even as her hands shook. "Help is coming. Keep breathing. Slow and steady. That's it." And then, without thinking about who might be listening, Elowen prayed. Not loudly or performatively, but under her breath, the way her mother had taught her. Simple words asking for mercy, for healing, for peace regardless of outcome. Cordelia's eyes focused on Eloan's face. Through her pain, through her fear, she saw something that made her go still. Complete presence. Unconditional care. The kind of love that doesn't calculate cost or benefit. She tried to speak, but Eloan shushed her gently. Don't talk. Save your strength. Just hold on. The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes. Paramedics took over with professional efficiency, loading Cordelia onto a stretcher, starting IVs, asking questions Eloan answered clearly. She had noted Cordelia's medications, her symptoms, the timeline of the attack. She provided information that would later help doctors make critical decisions. As the ambulance doors closed, Cordelia's hand reached out one more time. The paramedic saw it and called to Eloan. She's asking for you. Eloan climbed into the ambulance without hesitation, without asking permission, without considering that she was still just the paid guest who wasn't supposed to matter. She rode to the hospital holding Cordelia's hand, praying quietly while machines beeped and medical professionals worked to stabilize their patient. At the hospital, she stayed in the waiting room while the Crowe family arrived in their expensive cars, their faces masks of controlled emotion. She expected them to ask her to leave, to thank her politely and dismiss her. Instead, when the doctor emerged hours later with cautiously optimistic news, Cordelia's first question was not about her prognosis or treatment plan. She looked past her grandchildren, past the medical staff, and asked, "Where is the girl who held my hand?" The nurse pointed to Eloan, sitting alone in a corner chair, still wearing her dinner dress, now wrinkled and stained. Cordelia's eyes filled with tears. "Bring her to me," she said. "Not a request. A need." When Eloan entered the hospital room, Cordelia took her hand again. "You stayed," the older woman whispered. "Even when you could have left. Even when my family gave you every reason to walk away. Why?" Eloan's answer was simple and devastating in its honesty. "Because leaving people when they need you most is a betrayal I've already experienced. I won't become the thing that hurt me." And in that moment, Cordelia understood something her wealth had hidden from her for decades. Grace is not a transaction. It's a choice made by people who have every right to withhold it. She had spent her life accumulating power, but the woman holding her hand had something more valuable, a faith that transformed suffering into compassion instead of bitterness. "Not as a maid," Cordelia said, her voice gaining strength. "Not as a guest. I want you in my life as family. Real family. The kind built on character, not blood." She looked at Alistair, who stood frozen in the doorway. "This is what I've been trying to teach you. This is what worth actually looks like." The machines beeped steadily. Rain continued outside. And a billionaire's carefully constructed world began to crumble around the truth that poverty and wealth are conditions, but character is a choice. By morning, the Crowe family's carefully maintained image had cracked beyond repair. News of the investigation into Eloan had leaked, not from Eloan herself but from one of the background check services Rowena had hired. The story reached a journalist who specialized in exposing hypocrisy among New York's elite. By dawn, a blog post was circulating that painted the Crowe sisters as cruel, classist women who had tried to destroy a good person for the crime of being poor. The optics were devastating. A woman who had saved their grandmother's life was being publicly humiliated by the family she'd helped. Social media amplified the story. Former staff members from the Crowe household came forward with their own stories of mistreatment. Business partners began distancing themselves. The foundation that bore the Crowe name faced calls for investigation into its hiring practices and charitable claims. Maribel and Rowena found themselves on the defensive, issuing statements their lawyers had crafted, trying to control damage that had already spread too far. But the public had already chosen its narrative, and the Crowe sisters were not the heroes. Elowen packed to leave the hotel room Alistair had secured for her near the hospital. She had stayed through the night, checking on Cordelia periodically, praying in the chapel, trying to process everything that had happened. The $3,000 sat in an envelope on the dresser. She hadn't spent it yet. Part of her wondered if accepting it now would feel like confirmation of everything Maribel had accused her of. But then she thought of Marcus, who needed that laptop. Of Amara, who deserved dance classes. Of rent that wouldn't wait for her moral clarity. She had earned that money. Not by pretending to be someone she wasn't, but by showing up fully as herself. She took the envelope and placed it carefully in her bag. A knock interrupted her thoughts. When she opened the door, Cordelia Crowe stood there, leaning on a cane, flanked by nurses who looked concerned about her leaving the hospital so soon. "I discharged myself," Cordelia said before Eloan could protest. Against medical advice. Because some conversations matter more than precautions. Eloan stepped aside, letting the small procession enter. The nurses helped Cordelia to a chair, checked her vitals one more time, and left reluctantly after Cordelia waved them away with imperious certainty. Then the two women sat in silence, the kind of silence that holds years of unspoken truths. My grandchildren have embarrassed themselves in this family, Cordelia began. Their cruelty has been exposed and they're facing consequences I should have enforced decades ago. But that's not why I'm here. She paused, gathering strength. I'm here because last night, you showed me what I'd forgotten. That the measure of a person has nothing to do with their bank account and everything to do with their choices when no one's watching. Eloan felt tears building but refused to let them fall. You don't owe me anything, Mrs. Crowe. I did what anyone should do. But most people don't, Cordelia countered. Most people calculate. They consider. They protect themselves first. You didn't. You acted from something deeper than self-interest. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. I've rewritten my will. A significant portion of my estate will go to a foundation in your parents' names. It will fund scholarships for young people who've experienced loss. It will support community programs in neighborhoods like yours. And you will oversee it. Eloan's breath caught. I can't accept that. I'm not qualified. I don't have experience with. You have the only qualification that matters, Cordelia interrupted. You understand that wealth is a tool, not an identity. You know what it means to lose everything and choose grace anyway. That's more valuable than any business degree. She slid the folder across the table. This isn't charity, Eloan. It's restitution. For every person my family has looked down on. For every time we confused money with worth. The weight of the offer settled over Eloan like a mantle she hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. Because her mother's voice echoed in her memory. Sometimes God sends provision in packages we wouldn't choose. This was provision. Not just for her, but for the community that had held her together when she fell apart. On one condition, Eloan said quietly. Marcus and Amara stay my priority. The foundation doesn't change that. Family comes first. Cordelia smiled, and it was the first genuine smile Eloan had seen on her face. Family comes first, she agreed. Real family. The kind that shows up. The kind that stays. Alistair arrived an hour later, finding them still talking, planning, dreaming about what the foundation could become. He stood in the doorway watching two women from completely different worlds building something new together. His grandmother saw him and gestured him in. Sit down, Alistair, Cordelia said. We need to talk about what happens next. He sat, aware that he was about to face judgment he couldn't buy his way out of. Cordelia didn't soften her words. You hired this woman because you thought desperation made her controllable. You treated her like a prop in your performance of normalcy. And when your sisters attacked her, you didn't defend her. You worried about your reputation instead of her humanity. Each word landed like a stone. Alistair couldn't meet Eloan's eyes. I was wrong, he said simply. I don't have an excuse. No, Cordelia agreed. You don't. But you have a choice now. You can continue living like wealth is a shield from accountability. Or you can learn what Eloan already knows. That character is built in moments when it costs you something. Alistair finally looked at Eloan. She wasn't angry. She wasn't triumphant. She was simply present, waiting to see what he would choose. I'd like to start over, he said. Not as someone who hired you. As someone who wants to learn from you. If you'll let me. Eloan considered this. She thought about forgiveness, about the faith her mother had modeled, about the difference between enabling harm and offering redemption. I'll let you, she said carefully. But not because you're a Crowe. Because everyone deserves a chance to become who they're meant to be. Even people who start from privilege. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room. The poorest person at the table was extending grace to the richest. And that grace cost her nothing because she had learned the secret wealthy people spend lifetimes avoiding. You can't lose what you've already surrendered. Over the following weeks, the foundation took shape. Eloan worked with lawyers, accountants, and community leaders to build something sustainable. Marcus got his laptop and started coding programs that would eventually help the foundation track impact. Amara joined her dance classes and performed at a recital where Cordelia sat in the front row, crying openly. Maribel and Rowena faced their own reckonings. The family's board removed them from leadership positions. Old friends stopped calling. They were forced to confront what they'd become in the pursuit of maintaining status. Some people learn from humiliation. Others just get better at hiding. Alistair began showing up. Not with grand gestures or attempts to buy forgiveness, but with consistent, quiet presence. He volunteered at the Foundation's first community event. He listened more than he spoke. He started attending the same church Elowan's family had belonged to, sitting in the back, trying to understand the faith that had produced such resilience. And slowly something shifted in him. The desperation to prove his worth through achievement faded. The need to be impressive dissolved. He began to discover who he was beneath the money, beneath the name, beneath the expectations. It was uncomfortable work. But Elowen had shown him it was possible. Cordelia lived another 18 months. Long enough to see the Foundation award its first scholarships. Long enough to watch Elowen become the leader she'd always had the capacity to be. Long enough to tell her grandchildren one final truth before she passed. I spent my life building wealth. But Elowen taught me that the only thing we take with us is how we loved. Choose better than I did. It's not too late. At her funeral, it wasn't business associates or society figures who spoke most powerfully. It was the young people the Foundation had helped. The staff members she'd finally learned to see. And Elowen, who stood at the pulpit and spoke about a woman who had been transformed by grace in her final chapter. Mrs. Crowe spent most of her life believing security came from accumulation, Elowen said, her voice steady and clear. But at the end she learned what my mother tried to teach me, that we're most secure when we're most surrendered. When we stop protecting what we have and start sharing who we are. She didn't die rich. She died free. And that's a better inheritance than any fortune. The words echoed in the cathedral, settling into hearts that had been closed for years. Some people wept. Others sat in stunned silence. And a few, just a few, began to reconsider what they'd been building their lives around. Because sometimes God doesn't pull you out of the fire. Sometimes He seats you at the table and lets everyone else burn in their intentions. And sometimes the people who look most powerless are the ones carrying the only power that actually matters. The ability to choose love over self-protection, grace over revenge, and faith over fear. Elowen had walked into the Crowe mansion as hired help. She walked out as family. Not because she'd gained their wealth, but because she'd revealed their poverty. And in doing so, she'd offered them something money could never buy. A chance to become human again. Help us know if you want more stories like this. Comment lovely story. And turn on notifications so you won't miss the next one. So let me ask you, what would you have done in Elowen's place? Would you have stayed silent or spoken truth? Do you believe dignity is something money can buy, or something money often exposes? Tell us in the comments. We want to hear your truth. And if this story moved you, we need you to do something. Subscribe to this channel. Not just because we want the numbers, but because these stories matter. Hit that like button if Elowen's courage inspired you. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Thanks for watching.